a scream, a shadow, and a single step that led to death. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Revela. Let's grow this mystery-loving community. Tell me where you're watching from today. Your comments truly make this channel come alive. Let's dive in. The events which I am now about to set forth took place in the winter of 1894, during one of those prolonged spells of grey, brooding fog that wrapped London like a winding sheet and soaked the bones of all who dared to move through its shrouded streets. It was, in truth, one of the most dismal seasons I recall, a time when even the most bustling thoroughfares of the city seemed subdued by the thick, creeping murk that rolled down from the Thames and made gas lights appear no more than dull, flickering embers. On just such a morning, with the street outside Baker Street choked in the usual yellow fog and the fire within sputtering bravely against the chill, Sherlock Holmes stood with his back to the hearth, hands clasped behind him and eyes narrowed to slits, scanning a small square of notepaper with the intensity of a man deciphering ancient cuneiform. I sat across from him in my armchair, the Times folded on my knee and my coffee growing cold, observing my friend with the familiar mixture of fascination and unease he so often inspired in me. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "our quiet week appears to have concluded. A client is coming." "A client," I repeated. "On a morning like this? I should think the city itself would need a lantern to find its way." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Quite so. And yet she will be here within the next 7 minutes. A gentlewoman, anxious, traveling in haste." I glanced toward the window, though I could see little through the fog beyond the faint orange glow of the street lamp. "You've received a letter, then?" "Merely a note, delivered by a gloved hand, judging from the faint smudge of powder at the top corner and the indentation here, where the paper is pressed ever so slightly. Not the hand of a servant, mind you, too firm. The seal was broken in such a manner that suggests nervous energy, even desperation. Note the sharp tear." He handed me the sheet. The message itself was brief, hastily written in a flowing, slanted hand. "Mr. Holmes, I beg your attention at once. There has been a terrible occurrence at Highbury Crescent. I do not trust the explanations I have been given. Something is terribly amiss. I shall call upon you as soon as I am able. Please, do not disregard this." It was unsigned. "Curious," I murmured. "And Highbury Crescent? That's a respectable area, is it not?" "Indeed. A row of tall, well-kept houses, mostly leased by minor gentry and retired military men. Not the usual setting for a terrible occurrence, as she phrases it. But there's more to it than her words suggest." As if summoned by Holmes's foresight, there came a brisk knock at the door, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs and the voice of our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, announcing, "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. In quite a state." "Show her in at once," Holmes replied. A moment later, a figure swept into the room, a woman of no more than 30, though her features were drawn and pale with recent distress. Her dark hair was neatly pinned beneath a feathered hat, and her cloak was spattered with droplets of melted fog. She glanced about the room nervously before her eyes settled on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," she breathed, clasping her gloved hands together. Oh, thank heavens. I did not know where else to turn." "Please be seated," Holmes said gently, indicating the settee. "You have my attention. Tell me everything you can." She sank onto the edge of the seat, scarcely seeming to notice me. "My name is Clara Forrester. I am companion to Lady Eustacia Halberd at number 17, Highbury Crescent. I must tell you plainly that I believe her death last night was not the accident it's being made out to be." Holmes did not flinch. "Lady Halberd is dead." "Yes," Miss Forrester said, visibly swallowing the lump in her throat. "They say she fell down the stairs, tripped on the hem of her dressing gown. But I saw her body, Mr. Holmes. I saw her face. There was something dreadful in her expression, and more than that." She hesitated, glancing again toward the door as if someone might be listening. Holmes steepled his fingers. You need not fear. No one overhears us here." Miss Forrester drew in a breath. She was afraid, you see, all day yesterday, as if something or someone were watching her. She kept saying strange things, that the house had changed, that something had moved, that there was something waiting. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said it was on the stairs. I felt a distinct chill pass through me, despite the heat of the fire. Holmes, however, betrayed no emotion. "Continue, Miss Forrester." "She dined alone that evening. Lord Halberd was away at his club. I retired early and did not hear anything until the crash. The servants found her at the foot of the main staircase. Her neck was broken." "Who first discovered the body?" Holmes asked. "Parsons, the footman. He and the cook were in the kitchen, heard the noise and ran up." "Was the house locked?" "Yes, as always. Lord Halberd has the only key besides Parsons. No one saw or heard any visitor. The police have dismissed it as a tragic fall. But Mr. Holmes, I know something was wrong. That stair, it was always her greatest fear." "Her fear," I interjected. "Of stairs?" Miss Forrester nodded. "Yes. Ever since her accident 2 years ago, she tumbled from a horse and broke her leg. After that, she always clutched the rail, always counted each step." Holmes stood and began to pace slowly before the hearth. "And you say she was alone last night?" "As far as anyone knows. But the air in the house, something about it felt changed. I cannot explain it. It's only a feeling, but I could not stay. I left before dawn and came straight here." Holmes halted. "You did the right thing, Miss Forrester. I shall accompany you to Highbury Crescent within the hour." Her relief was evident, though her eyes still brimmed with fear. As she rose and thanked him, Holmes added, "One final question, Miss Forrester. When you say she said something was waiting, what exactly were her words?" "She said," Miss Forrester's voice trembled, "she said, 'It's waiting on the stair. I've seen it. Just at the turn. Watching.'" Holmes remained still for a moment, as if committing the phrase to some private mental ledger. When she had gone, I turned to him. "Do you believe there is truth in it?" Holmes gave a curious smile. "Come, Watson. There is no better way to start the day than with a staircase, a corpse, and a mystery that begins in whispers." He reached for his coat and gloves, and together we stepped into the fog. The fog clung to us as we climbed into the hansom cab, Holmes settling into his customary silence while I pulled my coat tighter about me and cast a sidelong glance at his profile. His eyes, half-lidded, betrayed nothing of the calculations I knew were already taking shape behind them. The note, the terrified witness, the unexplained fall, each fragment nested in his mind like a puzzle box awaiting the proper sequence. Highbury Crescent presented a quiet, solemn face as we arrived. Tall Georgian houses lining a clean, curved road, their iron railings trimmed with frost and windows shuttered against the cold. Number 17, the Halberd residence, sat at the bend where the fog was thickest, making the building seem oddly recessed, almost withdrawn from its neighbours. Miss Forrester, who had returned ahead of us by a separate cab, stood just within the open front door, her composure slightly restored. Holmes's gaze flicked up to the upper windows before he stepped inside. "No sign of the constabulary?" "They left just after dawn," she replied, stepping back. The inspector seemed satisfied it was an accident. "A conclusion reached far too easily, I fear," Holmes murmured, eyes already drifting along the polished wood paneling of the hall. The floor was pristine, no mud, no scuffs, though the faint trace of recent polishing betrayed the hurried hand of someone eager to tidy what should not be tampered with. He turned to Miss Forrester. "If I may see the body?" "She lies in the drawing room. The doctor came this morning, but—" "Thank you. That will suffice." We followed her into a dimly lit salon whose drapes had not yet been drawn open. The fire crackled low in the grate, the only movement in an otherwise still room. Lady Eustacia Halbert's body had been laid out on a fainting couch, her limbs carefully arranged, her face at peace now, but something of that terror Miss Forrester spoke of still lingered, etched faintly at the corners of her eyes and lips. Holmes knelt beside her without hesitation, removing his gloves. No visible trauma beyond the broken neck. Yet, he leaned closer, his long fingers gently tilting her head as he peered beneath the jawline. "Do you see this, Watson? A faint abrasion. Just here, behind the ear. Would you pass me the glass?" I handed him the small lens from his coat pocket. He scrutinized the area, then turned his attention to her right hand, lifting it with care. She clutched something before she died. Note the rigidity of the fingers, yet nothing was found in them. Curious. He stood, then approached the window. "What can you tell me about the stairway, Miss Forrester?" She hesitated. "It's just through there." Straight ahead and curving at the landing, she was found at the bottom. Without another word, Holmes strode from the drawing room and into the main corridor. The staircase rose with graceful curve, its carpet runner plush and clean, the banister gleaming. But Holmes's eyes narrowed immediately. Halfway up, just before the bend, he stopped and crouched, pressing his fingers lightly to the polished wood rail. "Here," he said. "Watson, have a look." I peered at the spot he indicated. The faintest smudge, oil or perspiration, marred the otherwise pristine surface. Just below it, along the wall, another smudge, this one lower, as if from the heel of a palm. "She stopped here," Holmes said softly. "Or more likely, someone else did." He rose and continued up the stairs. At the landing, he paused. "This is the turn she feared, I imagine. A blind angle. No window. A natural place for shadows and—" His voice stopped. He leaned closer to the base of the banister post and pulled a long, slender object from beneath it. It gleamed faintly in the morning gloom. "A hatpin," he said. "Gold-plated, with a glass bead." Miss Forrester gasped. "That's hers, Lady Halbert's. She lost one just yesterday." Holmes held it to the light, then turned and walked slowly down the stairs, each step deliberate, as though walking in someone else's footprints. "She was holding this," he said at last. "It fell, or she dropped it." But why hold it at all? He looked suddenly to the foot of the stairs. Where exactly was the body discovered? Miss Forrester led him to the spot, just a foot from the base, the area now scrubbed clean. Holmes knelt, fingers brushing the carpet, then shifted his gaze along the baseboard to a decorative niche nearby. Within it stood a Grecian bust on a slim pedestal. "This," Holmes murmured, stepping around it. "This would block a line of sight. Someone could stand behind it. Quite conveniently." He tapped the marble gently, then rose. "Tell me, Miss Forrester, was Lady Halbert expecting anyone last night?" "No, sir. Not that I knew of. She was withdrawn of late. After the horse accident, she became increasingly reclusive. Even her correspondence was handled by her husband or myself." "Her husband, Lord Halbert. When did he return?" "This morning at just after 8. Holmes nodded. "And is he aware of your decision to consult me?" "Number 1 left before he arrived." Holmes turned to me then. "Watson, you recall the case of the Abingdon widow, the fractured staircase step?" I nodded. Of course. The polished edge disguised the splinter that caught her hem. "Precisely. And yet in this case, no step is broken, no railing loose, and the fall occurred at a point of no known defect. Lady Halbert, it seems, was frightened. Frightened enough to clutch a pin as though it were a talisman. And that," he gestured to the pin, "was found at the very place she once confided was watching her. Curious, is it not, that she should fall there?" He turned to Miss Forrester. "I should like to speak with the footman, Parsons, as soon as may be." She rang a bell, and within minutes, a tall, thin man in a black coat appeared, stoic-faced, with a deferential bow. "You discovered the body?" Holmes asked, voice crisp. "Yes, sir. I heard a crash, rushed out from the kitchen, and saw her ladyship lying there." "Did you see anyone else? Hear any voices?" "No, sir. Just the fall. Cook was with me the whole time." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. "And no one else was awake?" "Not that I know of, sir." Holmes studied him a moment longer. "Very well, that will do." Parsons withdrew. Miss Forrester's hands twisted nervously. "What do you think, Mr. Holmes?" "I think," he said slowly, "that your instincts were correct. This was no accident. The fear Lady Halbert expressed, the phrase she used, that something was waiting, was not the delusion of a fragile mind. It was the observation of someone who noticed what others ignored." He walked to the window and looked out into the fog. "I shall require the guest list for the Halberts' social affairs over the past month, the names of any recent visitors, and access to Lady Halbert's personal effects, her letters, her journals, if any remain." Miss Forrester nodded. "Of course." "And Watson," Holmes added without turning, "make a note. The hatpin was not bent or broken, which means it was never dropped in a struggle." "You believe it was placed there?" "I believe," Holmes said softly, "that it was left behind deliberately, as a warning, or a mark, perhaps even a signature." The air seemed colder then, despite the fire crackling in the room behind us. I looked to the stair once more, and for a moment, in the curling shadow of the turn, I too imagined I saw something standing just at the bend, silent, watching, waiting. And Holmes, with that peculiar stillness that meant his mind had begun its descent into the labyrinth, only said, "There is more here than a fall. There is intent, and where there is intent, there is a hand behind the curtain." We remained there a moment longer before turning once more into the silence of the house. As we ascended once more to the upper floor of the Halbert residence, the air felt colder, though the fire in the drawing-room still hissed faintly behind us. Holmes led the way without speaking, his steps slow, methodical. I followed, glancing at the framed portraits lining the wall, ancestors in faded oil, their eyes watching with the weary permanence of old money and older secrets. At the top of the stairs, Holmes turned left, tracing his fingers lightly along the wooden balustrade. A faint line, perhaps from fingernails, perhaps not, ran along the varnish. He said nothing but crouched to inspect it again, lips tight, eyes alert. Miss Forrester said Lady Halbert rarely came up here. I offered, keeping my voice low out of respect for the atmosphere that still seemed to hang over the place like morning crepe. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And yet the disturbance ends here." He gestured to a small sitting room at the end of the corridor. It was a warm space by design. Red drapes, Turkish carpet, a writing desk beside the window. Everything looked in order, but Holmes walked directly to the desk and pointed to the top drawer. "Open it," he said. I did. Inside were neatly bundled letters, a blotter, a bottle of ink, and a folded ivory paper knife. Holmes reached in and removed the letters, flicking through the postmarks and seals. Most of these are from Lady Halbert's sister, one Margaret Linton, Yorkshire. The handwriting is steady, affectionate. But here, he plucked a particular envelope from the pile. Note the change in ink color, the slight tremble in the descenders. This letter was written in haste, perhaps under stress. He handed it to me. The contents were vague, references to feeling watched and a mention of a figure on the stairs. The letter concluded with a curiously abrupt line. "There is something wrong with the landing. Every time I pass it, I feel I'm not alone." I looked up to find Holmes already at the fireplace, inspecting the ashes in the grate. "This was burned recently," he said, still faintly warm. And yet no fire was laid here last night, according to Miss Forrester. He reached into the grate with the tongs and retrieved a curled fragment of scorched paper. The edge bore half a word. Urford, I said, puzzled. Holmes tapped it gently on the mantel. Perhaps part of a name, Ashford, Rutherford, or Halberd even. But look at the handwriting. Different again. Slanted left. Male, possibly. He slipped the fragment into his pocket. Watson, there is something deliberate in this. What is missing tells us as much as what remains. Someone wanted that note destroyed, but not thoroughly. It was burned here, where the flames would leave no trace, unless, of course, someone came looking with particular intent. He moved again to the desk, this time lifting the blotter and holding it to the light. Ah, he said, pleased. There's something here. He reached for a pencil and lightly shaded over the surface. Slowly, the ghost of a message began to appear, words pressed into the blotting paper from a note long removed. Know you're here. The stair is no longer safe. If I disappear, it was not an accident. Holmes's face sharpened as he read the final line. Don't trust him. He looked at me, eyes gleaming. She wrote this shortly before her death. And him could refer to anyone, I said, feeling the weight of the words. Quite so, but it narrows the field. Lady Halberd believed someone close to her posed a threat, someone familiar enough with the house to use the architecture against her. Let us consider who that could be. We returned to the hallway, where Miss Forrester met us with a bundle of leather-bound journals. These were in her dressing table, she said softly. She was always private about them. I never dared look. Holmes accepted the books with a polite nod and opened the top volume. It was neat and methodical, each page dated, each entry brief. He flipped through a dozen pages in silence before pausing. Listen to this, he said. January 8th. Heard the creak again on the landing. I checked. No one there. Parsons insists the wood swells in the cold, but I know the sound of weight. 2 steps, then stillness. He turned another page. January 12th. Eustace asked again about the will. He's never spoken of it before. I pretended not to notice. His tone was casual. But why now? Holmes closed the book. Watson, it is becoming clearer. I nodded. You suspect her husband. I suspect he must be questioned, but it is not yet proof. The journals give us her state of mind, anxiety, growing fear, and yet her death, to the police, is explained by a hem and a staircase. Miss Forrester looked stricken. Do you think Lord Halberd meant her harm? Holmes's expression was unreadable. I think she believed someone close to her had both motive and opportunity. That does not prove guilt, but it is enough to proceed with care. At that moment we heard the front door open and the muffled sound of a man's voice below. Holmes glanced at the hall clock. That will be Lord Halberd now. We descended together. A tall man in his 50s stood in the front vestibule, removing his gloves with sharp, efficient movements. His mustache was neat, his bearing that of a man long accustomed to command, though his face wore signs of fatigue. Mr. Holmes, I presume? He said, and Dr. Watson. I was told you'd come. My late wife's companion insisted it was necessary. She was correct, Holmes replied. There are elements of your wife's death that remain unsettled. Halberd stiffened. I'd hoped this matter might be laid to rest, but if you must ask questions, I will oblige you, though I cannot imagine what fresh tragedy you hope to unearth. Did your wife ever express fear regarding the stairs? Holmes asked directly. Halberd frowned. She was cautious, ever since the fall from the horse. But fear, that seems too strong a word. She never mentioned anything unusual in the house. Only the usual nonsense about footsteps and shadows. I told her it was nerves. The doctor agreed. Holmes studied him. And the will she referred to in her journal, has it been altered recently? That drew a long silence. Then Halberd said carefully, We discussed updating it. Nothing more. Holmes nodded. Thank you. I would ask that no one disturb the sitting room or Lady Halbert's desk. I may need to revisit them. As you wish. We left him there, the heavy door closing behind us, and stepped once more into the fog. Holmes paused at the top of the steps, his gaze distant. You believe he's hiding something, I said. Of course he is, Holmes replied. But whether it is guilt or merely convenience, I cannot yet say. What troubles me most, Watson, is that Lady Halbert knew she might die. She wrote as much, but she did not name her killer. We began walking toward the cab stand, the mist curling around us like cautious fingers. She didn't know who it was? I asked. Holmes shook his head slowly. Number she knew exactly who it was, but naming them, putting it in ink, was the one thing she feared more than death itself. His voice was grave now. And so she left a trail, a faint one. It is our task to follow it to the end. The fog had not lifted by the time we returned to Baker Street, but Holmes, rather than withdrawing to his armchair and pipe, as was his custom after a field investigation, remained standing near the window, his gaze drifting through the condensation that clung to the pane like breath on glass. I seated myself with a weary sigh, for the day's chill had settled deep into my shoulders, and I longed for nothing more than warmth and a quiet tea. Yet Holmes's restlessness signaled that his mind had not paused, even as our footsteps had. You've a theory already, I ventured, stirring the fire. Not a theory, Watson, a suspicion, one which will remain toothless until it is sharpened by evidence. He turned and crossed the room, retrieving the charred paper fragment from his pocket and placing it on the small table beside the lamp. This, he said, tapping it gently, was a mistake. You mean its survival? No, I mean its destruction. Someone believed this piece of correspondence held danger, but if the entire note were truly damning, they would have taken the time to burn it to ash. Instead, it was left incomplete. Rushed, perhaps interrupted, and only one person in that house seemed to know precisely what Lady Halbert feared. Miss Forrester. Holmes nodded once. She noticed everything, Watson. Too much for a mere companion. The letter she delivered bore the marks of someone handling not her own fear, but someone else's tragedy with almost surgical calm. Yet when we were in the sitting room, did you observe her eyes? I thought back. Yes, they rarely looked where you did. She watched you instead. Precisely. As if anticipating what I might discover. There are layers at work here, and I intend to peel each one. A knock at the door interrupted us. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson brought up a telegram on a small brass tray. Holmes opened it silently and handed it to me. To Sherlock. Home stop inquiry into Halbert financials underway. Stop Lord Halbert suffered significant losses last quarter. Stop Inspector Baines. Holmes's smile did not reach his eyes, and now we glimpsed the motive. Money. A motive as old as Cain, I murmured. Holmes seated himself at last, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He asked her about the will. She noted it in her journal. Now we learn that his estate is weakened. A suspicious fall, and a body found without signs of forced struggle or intrusion. The picture is clear, but too clear, almost theatrically so. No man planning murder with such care would allow a burnt note to survive or make himself so plainly suspect. I leaned forward. Then are you saying he is innocent? I'm saying he is obvious, and you must always doubt the obvious when it appears at the beginning rather than the end. That evening passed in silence as Holmes pored over the journals, cross-referencing them with the names on social invitations Miss Forrester had provided. Meanwhile, I examined the burned note under the lens. Though the paper was nearly destroyed, the ink that formed the half-word had bled faintly around the edges. Someone had pressed hard when writing. I pointed this out to Holmes. Indeed, he said. Someone unused to deception, perhaps, and yet desperate. The next morning, the fog finally lifted, though the streets remained slick with the residue of its passing. Holmes sent me ahead to the Public Records Office with a short list of names to cross-check. Margaret Linton, Eustace Halberd, Clara Forrester, and a certain Franklin Adley, whose name had appeared in the edge of a guest list Holmes found tucked into the back of Lady Halberd's desk. When I returned shortly before noon, Holmes was pacing, coat on, hat in hand. "Well," he asked. "Margaret Linton is as she claims to be, a widow in Yorkshire, minor property holder, no suspicious entries. Eustace Halberd inherited his title 8 years ago, but has lost nearly half the land his father held. He mortgaged the southern fields twice in the last 5 years. As for Clara Forrester," I paused. "Yes." Holmes's voice was low but sharp. "She was born Clara Adley. Franklin Adley's sister, their father, died in debtor's prison. Franklin was accused of embezzlement but never convicted. He vanished from London in 1890. No current address." Holmes's mouth tightened. "So, the companion was once the sister of a man disgraced. A man who disappeared, and yet whose name was faintly preserved in a scrap of scorched paper. You think Franklin returned? I think someone tried to warn Lady Halberd, and who better than the sister of a vanished man? Unless, of course, the sister was not a messenger, but an accomplice." We returned at once to Highbury Crescent. This time we were not welcomed by Miss Forrester, but by Parsons, the footman who hesitated visibly before letting us in. "She's in the blue parlour," he said. "Bit unwell, she is." Holmes merely nodded and made directly for the drawing-room instead. Once inside, he moved again to the fireplace and retrieved a poker, tapping it along the interior of the grate. "Watson," he said, "you see here? The remnants of an older fire, beneath the ash of last night. There was something else burned before we arrived. I knelt beside him. A darker stain. Oil, perhaps? Or wax," Holmes said grimly. "Sealing wax. Whoever destroyed the original message also destroyed something else. Perhaps correspondence. Perhaps a sealed will." He stood, turned, and said, "We must speak to Miss Forrester." We found her pale and seated, her eyes red-rimmed but otherwise dry. "I must ask you something directly," Holmes said at once. "When did you last see your brother Franklin?" She flinched, barely perceptibly. 2 months ago. He came to me in secret. He said he needed help. I gave him none. I thought he had changed. But he was still filled with resentment." "Resentment against Lord Halberd?" "Yes. Franklin claimed Lord Halberd ruined our father, that he'd manipulated a deal to strip him of his last holdings. I didn't want to believe it, but then Lady Halberd told me she'd seen someone in the house. A man. She never saw his face. I feared." She stopped, trembling. Holmes did not interrupt. "I feared Franklin had returned, that he meant harm. I begged her to leave the house, but she refused. She said she couldn't leave, that she had to stay until she was sure." "Sure of what?" I asked. Miss Forrester looked up. "That the past hadn't come back to kill her." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And what became of your brother?" "I don't know," she whispered. "He vanished again." Holmes looked at me. "Then it is time we found him." He turned back to her. "And if you have any love for your mistress's memory, Miss Forrester, you will tell me now. Did you burn her letter?" She lowered her eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "She wrote it the day before she died. She told me to destroy it if anything happened to her. I tried, but I couldn't finish. I was too late." Holmes studied her a moment longer, then turned on his heel. "Come, Watson. Our next visit must be to the clerk at the Land Registry Office. If Franklin Adley returned, he would have come with purpose, and purpose always leaves a paper trail." Outside, the day was clear, but the shadow of the staircase lingered behind us. We found ourselves once more traversing the slick, grey arteries of London, the early afternoon streets pulsing with hansoms and the dull clatter of iron-shod wheels over cobblestones. Holmes said little during our ride to the Land Registry Office, but I could sense the accelerated rhythm of his thoughts by the manner in which he drummed his long fingers against the polished head of his walking stick. His gaze was fixed on some distant mental map, plotting intersections I could only guess at. When we arrived, Holmes marched through the entrance with such brisk authority that the clerk on duty, an aging man with ink-stained cuffs and spectacles perched on a high brow, rose before we'd even introduced ourselves. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, adjusting his glasses. "You're expected." "Expected?" I asked in surprise. The clerk nodded. "Inspector Baines sent word. Said you might inquire about records concerning certain land transactions tied to the Halbert estate." Holmes offered a slight smile. "Efficient, as always. Yes, we'll need the files on the Halbert holdings over the past 10 years, especially any involving third parties bearing the name Adley or associated pseudonyms." The man led us through to a narrow chamber lined with shelves of folios and drawn curtains that dulled the light to a dusty gloom. After 10 minutes of sorting through ledgers and index slips, he produced 3 books and laid them on the table. "Here, entries relating to the Halbert estate." Holmes bent over the volumes, flipping quickly through the dense columns of legal jargon. He halted at one page and tapped it. "There." I peered over his shoulder. "August 1890. Transfer of small tract in Suffolk, 3 acres, from Halbert Holdings Limited to a Mr. F. Arden of Durham. Cash purchase, witnessed by J. L. Cotteridge, solicitor." "F. Arden," I read aloud. "A pseudonym?" "Without doubt. Franklin Adley was born in Durham, and if my memory serves, his maternal grandfather's name was Arden." Holmes's finger traced the lines below. He paid in cash. No mortgage, no lien, and yet Adley vanished in the same year. Why would a disgraced financier on the run purchase a rural tract in his own name, or rather, an obvious alias? "He meant to disappear," I suggested, "to establish a place from which to operate, away from the scrutiny of the city." "Perhaps, but I believe it's more than that." Holmes snapped the book shut and rose. "We shall wire the local constable at once and request a quiet visit to the address. No need to stir the brush unless we know something rustles beneath it." Outside, the fog had returned, rolling low across the ground and curling against the corners of buildings like something alive. Holmes stopped at a telegraph office while I waited beside the cab. As he emerged, he paused mid-stride. "Watson," he said, "what was your impression of Miss Forrester's admission?" "That she burned the letter out of loyalty. She was frightened, guilt-ridden perhaps, but not malicious." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Precisely, which makes one thing very curious. She did not destroy the journals." I frowned. Perhaps she didn't think they were damning. But one of them contained an explicit suspicion regarding her brother's return, and another noted the conversation about the will, yet she left them untouched. Either she was careless, or she intended for them to be found. Why? We returned to Baker Street for a late luncheon, during which Holmes reviewed the letter from Margaret Linton once more. This time, however, he read it aloud, pausing at a sentence near the end. "Your last note disturbed me. I wish you'd speak to Eustace clearly. There's no reason for shadows between a husband and wife." "Watson," he said suddenly, "you remarked once during the Conkle affair that fear silences some people while making others speak too freely. I wonder now if Lady Halbert was the latter." I leaned forward. "You think she revealed too much?" "I think she revealed something to someone who was not ready to receive it." A knock at the door interrupted us, and Mrs. Hudson handed in a telegram. Holmes tore it open. "From Constable Pendlebury, Suffolk Stop Property. Registered as per inquiry is unoccupied. Stop adjoining farmer states. He saw lights 2 nights ago. Stop no footprints visible this morning. Stop requesting advice before entry. Stop, Holmes tapped the paper. He's clever. He suspects something without alerting anyone. But this confirms it. Franklin Adley is not gone. He is close. And he is watching. The next morning we were summoned once more to Highbury Crescent. This time not by Miss Forrester but by Lord Halberd himself. His note was brief and almost combative in tone. Mr. Holmes, recent events compel me to request your presence immediately. Something has occurred which defies any explanation I can offer. Come at once. Eustace Halberd. When we arrived, the household was in quiet disarray. Curtains were drawn. Parsons met us with a pale expression. "It's Miss Forrester, sir," he whispered. "She's gone." "Gone?" I repeated. "Vanished. Her bed was unslept in. One of the back doors was left ajar. Her cloak is missing. Lord Halberd found her note not an hour ago." He led us to the study, where Halberd stood by the fire, his shoulders hunched. Without a word, he handed Holmes a folded page, written in the same slanted hand I'd seen on Lady Halberd's earlier letter. "Mr. Halberd, I cannot stay. I believe I'm being followed. Please forgive my sudden departure. I have left the journals with Mr. Holmes. They are safer with him. Please do not search for me. If you do, more than my name will vanish." C.F. Holmes read it twice, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "She has gone to her brother," he said quietly. "That much is certain." "But why warn him not to follow?" I asked. "Because she suspects he will, and she knows he values reputation above all. But the key lies in her final words. More than my name will vanish. She believes something will be taken, perhaps someone." Halberd's voice was low and strained. "This is absurd. I've done nothing. I was asleep the night she disappeared." Holmes's eyes didn't leave him. "And who in your household knew about Franklin Adley's return?" "No one. And yet someone left that back door open. Someone knew she would flee." The silence that followed was thick with implication. Holmes turned and moved toward the stairs again. "Watson," he said, "return to the sitting room. Look once more beneath the corner of the rug near the writing desk. There is something that's nagged at me since our first visit." I obeyed at once, and with Parsons' help, lifted the thick rug away from the parquet floor. There, barely visible, was a faint depression in the wood, an uneven notch. I pressed it. Nothing happened. Holmes knelt and examined it with the lens. "Not a spring," he said, "but a keyhole, hidden and shaped unusually. Something was once secured here, beneath the desk, inside the floor. A compartment." Holmes nodded. "And it has been opened recently." I looked to Parsons, who shook his head. "I've never seen it, sir." "But Miss Forrester might have," Holmes said, "and I believe she took something with her when she fled. Something more valuable than the journals." He stood, brushing dust from his coat. "We must go to Suffolk." The firelight cast long shadows on the walls as we left the house behind, and I could not help but feel that the stair, silent now, had simply paused to watch its next victim climb. The journey to Suffolk was long, the countryside blurring past our carriage window in the haze of winter's waning light. Holmes sat with his chin pressed into the high collar of his coat, the brim of his hat pulled low as if insulating his mind from distraction. He had spoken little since our abrupt departure from Highbury Crescent, yet his silence felt anything but idle. Occasionally he tapped a rhythm against his knee, each beat precise, deliberate. I knew it well. It was the sound of a theory being tested and retested, thread by thread. It was nearing dusk when our carriage turned off the main road onto a narrow frozen lane flanked by skeletal trees and hedgerows silvered with frost. The fields stretched wide and bare, broken only by the silhouette of a squat stone cottage nestled behind a collapsing gate. A flicker of smoke from the chimney gave the place the appearance of life, though the windows remained dark. "This," Holmes murmured, "is the place registered to F. Arden, a false name tied to a very real disappearance." We disembarked in silence. The air was sharp, the cold biting at our hands, even through gloves. Holmes approached the cottage first, boots crunching lightly over the frost, and rapped twice on the weathered door. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It turned. Inside, the cottage smelled of damp timber, old soot, and, faintly, something metallic. The interior was modest but orderly. A single oil lamp flickered on a low table beside a worn armchair, casting a golden halo over the room. The hearth was still warm, a kettle left atop the iron grate. On the small writing desk in the corner, scattered pages fluttered faintly in the draught from the open door. Holmes motioned me to close it behind us as he moved directly to the desk. I followed, scanning the room for signs of occupation. There were 2 cups on the sideboard, both unwashed, and a scarf draped across the back of the chair. I stepped forward and picked it up. "Miss Forrester's," I said quietly. I recognized the embroidery. Holmes didn't answer. He had already begun reading the topmost sheet on the desk, then swiftly gathered the rest, sifting through them as if searching for one particular phrase. At last he found it and read aloud. "I've done what I can. The letters are gone. If you're reading this, it means he has followed her, but he won't find what he's looking for. Not now." He placed the page down, face unreadable. "Franklin was here, and so was Clara. But they've left. Not long ago." He stepped to the window and peered out across the fields. "There are fresh wheel ruts and footprints. 2 sets, one heavier, leading away. The other, hers, half covered. I'd wager they left not an hour before our arrival." I joined him, squinting through the dusk. Where would they go? Somewhere safe, somewhere Franklin believes he cannot be traced. But Clara was clever. She left that page deliberately, and she took the documents from the Halberd house for a reason. "Do you believe she means to expose him, her brother?" "I believe she means to protect someone. The question is, whom?" We searched the cottage thoroughly. In a small drawer beneath the bed, Holmes found a folded piece of cloth containing 2 items, a letter with the Halberd crest and an old photograph, cracked and faded. It showed a younger Eustace Halberd shaking hands with a man who could only be Franklin Adley. Between them stood a woman, Lady Halberd, unmistakably younger, but her expression was stiff, wary. Holmes examined the photograph closely. "This is older than I thought, taken before the scandal, long before Clara ever entered the picture." He studied the letter next. It was brittle at the edges, but preserved. The ink had run in places. "Eustace, I warned you. If you tamper with the accounts again, I will go to the board. You used me once. I will not allow you to use me again. F." Holmes placed it beside the photograph, his voice taut. "So, that's it. Franklin was not merely ruined by Halberd's dealings. He was entangled in them, a willing accomplice at first, then a threat. No wonder he disappeared. But why return?" I asked. "And why now?" "Because Lady Halberd discovered the truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, she learned what Franklin never knew." He stood abruptly and moved to the fire, lifting the kettle and sniffing its spout. Still warm. They were preparing to leave, likely heard our carriage. At that moment, we heard it too, a distant creak of wheels on gravel. Holmes extinguished the lamp at once and motioned me into the shadow beside the hearth. We waited, breath held as the sound drew nearer, then halted just outside the gate. A moment later, the door opened. 2 figures stepped inside. The first was tall, narrow-shouldered, with streaks of gray at his temples. Franklin Adley, unmistakably aged but recognizable from the photograph. Behind him came Clara, her cloak pulled tight, her eyes wary even before she saw us. She froze. "Mr. Holmes." Adley's reaction was slower. "You," he said, voice low. "I should have known." Holmes stepped forward but did not reach for the handcuffs I expected. His tone was calm. "No need for dramatics, Mr. Adley. We've come not to arrest, but to understand. And I believe you want the truth known more than anyone." Adley gave a sharp laugh. "Is that what you think, that I came back to clear my name? I think you came back to see him fall, just as you once did." Adley's jaw clenched. Clara moved forward, placing a hand on her brother's arm. "It's over, Frank. We can't keep hiding." Holmes looked from one to the other. "Lady Halberd found the ledgers, didn't she? The original ones. Hidden beneath the floor. She confronted you." "She confronted Eustace," Adley interrupted. "She sent for me. I hadn't heard from her in years. She was afraid. And she feared she'd be silenced," Holmes said softly. "So she brought you back?" Adley nodded. "She wanted the truth documented. She said she couldn't live in that house another day. She told Clara everything." "But she didn't live another day," I said. "No," Clara whispered. "She was pushed." There was silence, save for the ticking of a small clock on the mantel. "She told me Eustace had changed," Adley said at last, "that he had become careful. Cold. He needed her gone, but he wouldn't risk blood. He used fear. He let the house do the work." "And the staircase," I murmured. "She never fell," Clara said. "He waited for her. At the turn, just like she always feared." Holmes exhaled. "And you have the ledgers?" Clara nodded, pulling a wrapped parcel from beneath her cloak. "These prove everything. How he moved the money. How he set father up to take the fall. How he arranged Franklin's silence." "You kept them," Holmes said, "because you knew they were your only protection." Clara's voice was trembling. "And now?" Holmes stepped back. "Now we go to Scotland Yard. If you're telling the truth, and I believe you are, this will bring justice not just for Franklin, but for Lady Halberd as well." Adley looked away, jaw clenched. "She died trying to undo the damage I helped cause." Holmes placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Then let the end be different from the beginning." Outside, the fog had returned, veiling the road in quiet silver. We rode in silence, the parcel between us like a beating heart. As we approached the city, Holmes said quietly, "Sometimes, Watson, it is not the guilty who vanish into the mist. It is the truth, unless someone dares to carry it back." Our return to London was met by a night sky hung heavy with low ash-grey clouds, the gaslights casting long, shivering reflections upon the wet cobbles as our carriage rattled toward Baker Street. Holmes, seated opposite me, remained as still as a carved effigy, his eyes fixed not on the city rolling past the windows, but on the ledgers nestled beside him. Wrapped in oilcloth, they might have appeared to the casual observer as no more than a bundle of old documents, yet I knew, and so did Holmes, that within them lay the unassailable skeleton of Eustace Halberd's deceit. When we arrived, it was well past midnight, and yet Holmes did not suggest we rest. Instead, he laid the documents out upon the table beneath the lamp, his long fingers peeling back each page with the same reverence he might have shown a rare monograph or an insect pinned under glass. "There," he said at last, tapping a column near the spine of the first book. "Notice the withdrawals from the Arden account. Sums precisely matching deposits made to Halberd Holdings under the name of a fabricated client, B. Whittam." I leaned in, and all dated within weeks of Franklin Adley's disappearance. Indeed, Halberd laundered his own misappropriated funds through a shell identity, implicating Adley by association. The perfect arrangement. Adley was already a suspect from his previous dealings, and his subsequent disappearance sealed the narrative. Holmes turned to the next page. "But this is what Lady Halberd must have discovered. Ledger entries corrected in different ink months later. Look here. These additions are in her hand. She was tracking him. And he knew." "Yes. But her weakness was not the evidence. It was fear. She waited too long, tried to confirm too much. He must have sensed her growing certainty." That's when he turned to psychological pressure. The whisper on the stair. Holmes nodded once. She feared something was waiting for her, something watching. Halberd ensured she felt that way. The subtle movements of furniture, the sound of a step. He used her own mind as the murder weapon, until at last she stood at the bend she feared most. I could not suppress a shiver, and in that moment, he was there, just beyond her sight. All it took was one shove. We sat in silence a while. Then Holmes rose and crossed to the fire, his gaze distant. "We shall go to Lestrade at Scotland Yard in the morning," he said. "The ledgers are unforgeable, and Adley's testimony, however compromised, will carry weight once verified against these figures. Clara has given us the key." "She was brave," I said. "Too brave, perhaps, for her own safety." "She risked her freedom to undo a wrong," Holmes said quietly, "and not one of her own making." I went to bed that night with the grim weight of the affair settling deep in my chest. Despite all Holmes had uncovered, I could not shake the image of Lady Halberd standing alone on that stair, her hand perhaps on the railing, her mind split between dread and disbelief, until the moment when neither thought nor voice could save her. The following morning dawned brittle with frost. Holmes and I arrived at Scotland Yard just as Inspector Lestrade was finishing his tea in the cluttered warmth of his office. He greeted us with narrowed eyes and a frown that spoke more to anticipation than doubt. "You said you had something urgent," he said, "and given the hour of your telegram, I suspect I'm not to enjoy it." Holmes laid the ledgers on the desk and opened the photograph between them like a dealer presenting his final hand. "These," he said, "document a pattern of financial misdirection engineered by Eustace Halberd over a 5-year period. The accounts falsely implicated Franklin Adley, whose disappearance was no coincidence but a necessity. Lady Halberd uncovered the fraud. She confided in Clara Forrester. Within a week, she was dead." Lestrade lifted one ledger and began flipping through it, the deepening crease in his brow confirming his understanding. Holmes continued. "Adley returned at his sister's summons. He brought no threat, only confirmation. She believed her brother had been used. She was right. What she did not expect, I suspect, was that her mistress would die before she could reveal it. That changed everything." Lestrade grunted. "And the girl? Forrester?" "She took the ledgers and fled. Out of fear, yes, but also duty. She's prepared to testify." Lestrade gave a long, low whistle. "Halberd's no fool. If he suspects she's alive and in contact with us, he will act," Holmes finished, "which is why you must move now." By late afternoon, warrants had been signed. Halberd was brought in under the guise of a routine inquiry. Holmes and I were present as the questioning began, but Holmes, never fond of procedural repetition, left before the formal interview concluded. I remained behind to observe Halberd's reaction when the ledgers were placed before him. He paled, but did not speak. Only when Lestrade pointed to the signature beside the F. Arden purchase did Halberd's composure slip. "That's not mine," he said. "Anyone could have written that." "Except it matches the hand on your private contracts," Lestrade replied. "Where did you find this?" "In a place your late wife hoped you'd never discover." Halberd's mouth tightened. His knuckles went white on the arms of the chair. "You have nothing," he said after a long moment. "We have everything," I said, standing, "and a witness." For the first time, Halberd looked at me. His eyes were not angry, but empty. Cold and exhausted. The look of a man who had spent his genius on concealment and found no imagination left for truth. I returned to Baker Street that evening to find Holmes seated at the table with a single envelope before him. "She left this," he said, sliding it to me. "Clara." I opened it carefully. The handwriting was hers, delicate, composed. "Mr. Holmes, I have done what I can. I do not regret it, but I cannot stay in London. My name is too thin a shield now, and Franklin is not strong enough to live beneath its shadow. You will find him at the station by midnight. I ask only that you allow him to leave. He has suffered enough in silence. Let him find peace somewhere far from these shadows. As for me, I will go north as I once did long ago. Perhaps there is comfort in the quiet, or at least the absence of footsteps on the stair. Thank you for seeing through the fog. Sir F.I. looked up. You let him go. Holmes gave a faint smile. Let us say I preferred he not be found. Outside, the fog had returned. It pooled at the corners of the street and clung to the lamplight like memory. Holmes stood and moved to the window, his voice calm. Justice is not always precise, Watson. Sometimes it requires that one lie be untangled while another is permitted to fade. I nodded slowly. And the house? He turned, his eyes thoughtful. It will stand empty for a time. But no stair, no matter how finely carved, remembers. Only the living do. And with that, he turned back to the window, the soft yellow light of the fire behind him, and the fog before, like all things not yet solved, waiting. The wind pressed against the window panes of Baker Street with long, mournful sighs, as if the very air of London were exhaling the final breath of a case now gasping into silence. Holmes had not moved from the hearth since I read aloud the last line of Clara Forrester's letter. The fire, once lively, had settled into a gentle hiss, and the flickering glow cast our shadows high and long upon the ceiling, like the residue of people who had seen too much. Holmes had said little. He had merely nodded when I confirmed that Franklin Adderley had boarded the late northbound train from Euston under an assumed name. His collar turned up, a small suitcase in hand. No constables had followed. No telegrams had been sent. It was done. And yet, despite the arrest of Eustace Halberd, despite the safety now afforded to the living, there lingered a peculiar unease within me, as though the house at Highbury Crescent, its stairwell, its watchful shadows, had left behind a scent not easily cleansed. Perhaps it was the quietness of the crime that unsettled me. There had been no blood, no weapon, no visible bruise, just fear expertly cultivated, and then a fall. "You've not smoked all evening," I said at last, rising to stir the fire. "It must weigh on you still." Holmes looked up, his gaze sharp even in repose. "Not the guilt, Watson, the elegance." I turned, puzzled. "Halberd's method," he said softly. "No direct act of murder, just arrangement, influence, the creation of atmosphere. He didn't need to raise a hand, only to observe, to understand the weakness of a mind already bruised by past trauma and guide it, inch by inch, toward the place where it would break." He folded his hands. "It is a rare thing to study such restraint in evil." "You sound almost admiring." Holmes's mouth tightened. "Admiration is not approval, but one must acknowledge design. He knew his wife's every fear. He knew how she moved, how she thought. It was intimacy weaponized, a kind of psychological strangulation." I thought of Lady Halberd again, descending the stairs alone, of the invisible thread that had tugged at her until the moment her feet gave way to gravity. I shivered. "You said she waited too long," I murmured. "That she doubted too much." "She was careful," Holmes replied. "Too careful. She feared that to act in haste might invite something worse. That's the difference between knowledge and conviction, Watson. One guides the mind, the other forces the hand. She had the first, but not the second." He rose then and crossed to the window. The fog had thinned, revealing the dim outline of the lamp-posts below, glistening wet and yellow in the early hours. "There is one thread still loose," he said. I looked up quickly. "Which?" Holmes tapped the window pane lightly. "Parsons." "The footman?" "Yes." He turned from the glass, his eyes suddenly distant. "He was the first to find the body, the one who cleaned the stairs, the one who had access to the lower floors, even as Lady Halberd remained upstairs, and he never left the house. But you said yourself there was no sign of a second party. I said there was no sign of violence. There was a difference. I stood slowly. You think he assisted Halbert? I think we should return to Highbury Crescent. The cab ride was silent. The streets were empty, save for milkmen and the occasional constable walking his slow morning beat. The house loomed out of the grey, shuttered and still. It felt wrong to approach it again, not because of fear, but because it no longer belonged to the living. Its secrets had been pried open like floorboards, its grief spent. Holmes rang the bell. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Parsons stood there, his face paler than I remembered, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "I didn't expect you," he said flatly. Holmes stepped past him. "No one does. That's rather my habit." I followed as Holmes made straight for the drawing room. He paused at the foot of the stairs, then turned slowly to the servant. "You've been in this house nearly 10 years, haven't you?" "Yes, sir. Long enough to know every creak and crack of these steps, I dare say." Holmes nodded. "Did Lady Halbert ever ask you to walk behind her on these stairs?" Parsons blinked. "Once or twice, when she was feeling unsteady. And you did?" "Of course." Holmes stepped forward. "Did you notice anything strange that night, anything that gave you pause?" Parsons hesitated, then looked away. "I heard her cry out." Holmes's voice was almost gentle. "You never said that before." "I didn't think—" Parsons' voice broke, then steadied. "I didn't want to believe she knew. I'd gone to the hall to check the lamps. She passed by me on the landing. Said nothing, just held the railing. But then she paused and turned back. She was whispering something. To herself?" Parsons shook his head. "To someone. But I saw no one there." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what did she say?" "She said, 'Not now. Please, I haven't finished.'" I felt the hairs on my arms stand. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. "She thought she would have more time," he said quietly. "And then she fell." Parsons looked up, stricken. "You think she saw him?" "I think she knew he was there, just out of sight," Holmes said. "And I think you heard it." "I didn't know what to do," Parsons said, almost pleading. "I ran to her. I thought, if I cleaned the stair, it would make things simpler, neater. I didn't mean—" Holmes raised a hand. "You meant to shield the house. You were loyal." Parsons nodded. "I served Lady Halbert, but I belonged to her husband." Holmes turned to me. "There, that is the last voice. The last piece." He stepped away from the stair and crossed back into the hall. "I'll inform Lestrade," I said. "No need. Parsons is no murderer. Just a man who mistook silence for duty." Back on Baker Street, as the sun finally threatened to break the horizon, Holmes removed the remaining notes from Clara Forrester's journal and tucked them into the firebox. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There's value in what she wrote." "There was value," he replied. "But it has been spent. The woman who wrote those pages no longer exists, and the man they feared now waits behind a cell door, not a stair." I poured 2 cups of coffee. Holmes took his, thoughtful. "She said in her letter she would go north," I said. "Do you believe she will return?" He shook his head. "She vanished once, Watson. People like her know how to stay gone." The fire cracked, the shadows retreated, and with them the house on Highbury Crescent faded into memory, its staircase no longer watching, but finally still. That same morning, as Holmes and I sat with cooling coffee and the embers of the fire whispering their last warmth, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were not yet finished. The case had yielded its culprit, its confessions, even its quiet acts of courage, but there remained something unresolved, a shape beneath the surface that Holmes had not named. I could feel it in his stillness. Though his hands rested upon the arms of his chair, his mind had not yet reclined. "You're not satisfied," I said at last. Holmes didn't look at me. I seldom am. You believe Parsons told the truth? I believe Parsons told what he knew, but I'm not convinced he knew everything. I leaned forward. What do you mean? He glanced toward the mantelpiece where Clara's letter lay folded beneath his pipe. Lady Halberd was many things. Watchful, cautious, perceptive. But she was not naive. If she feared for her life, she would not have kept all her knowledge in one place. Not in ledgers, not in journals. She would have placed it where only the right eyes could find it. I frowned. We recovered everything. The ledgers were sealed beneath the desk. The journals were in her dressing table. Holmes nodded slowly. And yet Parsons said she was whispering to someone just before she fell. Someone he did not see. She said, "Not now, please. I haven't finished." That is not a woman startled. That is a woman negotiating. You think someone else was there. I think someone else had been there all along. He rose and crossed to his desk, opening a drawer and removing a small notebook I recognized as his own. In it, he had jotted dates, locations, habits, and sequences, a chronicle of the investigation rendered in his unmistakable hand. "There," he said, tapping a line. Lady Halberd received a letter postmarked from Sussex 5 days before her death. She did not respond to it. It was unopened when we searched her belongings, but the name on the return address, G. Halberd. I blinked. A relation? An elder cousin, Gregory Halberd, once an attaché to the British consulate in Cairo, long estranged from the family after a property dispute with Eustace's father. He returned to England 3 months ago. And you think he... Holmes closed the notebook. I think he may have been the one Lady Halberd confided in before anyone else. A Halberd who might have had no reason to preserve Eustace's standing. You suspect he was in the house. I suspect he was in the periphery of this case the entire time, carefully omitted by those who had reasons not to mention him. Even Parsons said nothing, though a man like Gregory would not have gone unnoticed. Where is he now? Gone again. I wired the Foreign Office yesterday morning. His passport was reissued 6 weeks ago. He departed for Marseille 2 days before Eustace's arrest. I stared at Holmes. You believe he knew what would happen? I believe Lady Halberd, upon discovering the scale of her husband's deceit, reached out to the only member of the family she believed might help her from beyond the control of her household. Gregory Halberd was a diplomat, a man accustomed to subterfuge. It is not impossible that he came quietly to London, met her in secret, and was the one who advised her to collect the ledgers and journals. Perhaps even helped her hide them. If so, he may have also urged Clara Forrester to act when Lady Halberd died. But why leave now? Holmes looked at the folded letter on the mantel. Because the play was finished, the performance had ended, and Gregory Halberd, I believe, was the director behind the curtain. I was silent a long while. Then I asked, "Why didn't you follow him?" Holmes's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to see the trace of a smile flicker beneath his usual restraint. Because, Watson, not every truth requires arrest. Some only require confirmation. You think he came to ensure justice was done, quietly, discreetly. I think Lady Halberd knew she would not live long enough to see her husband undone, and so she left behind 2 guardians, her companion and the ghost of a cousin with nothing to lose, one to carry the burden, the other to light the match. Holmes turned from the mantel and looked directly at me. This was never merely a case of murder. It was a dismantling, layer by layer, of a man who believed himself untouchable, and it was executed with the patience of a woman who waited at the edge of a stair, knowing that to speak too soon might mean being unheard. The silence between us deepened, and then, just as the moment threatened to settle permanently, a tap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual reserved efficiency and handed Holmes a telegram. He opened it without ceremony. "It's from Lestrade," he said, reading quickly. "Halberd confessed to financial misdealings, but still denies the murder. The Crown intends to proceed with both charges." "Clara's testimony?" Unnecessary. The ledgers are enough. He folded the paper and placed it beside the letter on the mantel. Then he returned to the window, where the morning fog had all but vanished, leaving behind a brittle light that painted every rooftop with the same colorless honesty. I rose and joined him. "You believe she's truly gone?" I asked. "I believe Clara Forrester is not her name anymore. And somewhere in the north, a woman walks in peace with no stairs behind her and no footsteps in her wake." I nodded. "And Adley? He'll disappear again, quietly. Men like him don't linger near justice too long." We stood there a moment longer, two silhouettes cast against the window as London returned to its business. Somewhere in a courtroom, papers would be filed. Somewhere in a prison cell, Eustace Halberd would wait for judgment, not from the law, but from the memory of the woman he had failed to silence. And somewhere far from both places, a woman with a quiet voice and a steady hand would read a newspaper article beneath a borrowed name and know that the truth, her truth, had reached the world exactly as it was meant to. Holmes turned away, drawing the curtain. "I've had quite enough of stairs for a while," he said. "Let us take a walk. There's sun on the embankment." And as we stepped into the day, the door clicked shut behind us, and the shadow of Highbury Crescent was left at last where it belonged. In the past, with the secrets that had waited too long on the stair. The sun on the embankment was pale and watery, but it was sun all the same, and Holmes walked with his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze following the glimmer of the Thames as it slipped past Westminster. I walked beside him, neither of us speaking for a time. The case had left its mark. Not in the way of violence or spectacle, but in its quietness, its precision. It had been a study in erosion, the erosion of truth, of memory, of fear taking root so gently one hardly noticed until the foundation was gone. Holmes finally broke the silence. "Do you recall, Watson, the second journal entry Lady Halberd wrote? The one that mentioned her husband asking about the will?" "Yes," I said. "She said he'd never brought it up before, that it felt pointed." Holmes nodded. That phrase lingered with me. I had assumed, as did she, that the inquiry was motivated by greed. But now I wonder. I looked at him. "You mean he wasn't after her fortune?" "Oh, he was. But I believe the timing was more specific than we realized. I revisited the copy of her will this morning. A duplicate was filed by her solicitor in Kensington. And there's something curious." He stopped beside a bench overlooking the river and retrieved a folded page from his pocket. "She amended the will 6 weeks before her death. The changes were small, one minor codicil removed, but she added a clause." He handed me the document, and I scanned the final paragraph. "In the event of my death by accident or misadventure, I request that no inquest be waived on the grounds of domestic familiarity. I expressly request a post-mortem and a formal hearing with independent review." My eyes returned to Holmes. She feared it would be ruled a fall, that no one would look deeper. She ensured that if anything were to happen, the burden of silence would shift to the law itself. Holmes gazed out at the river again, but the clause was never enacted. Halberd produced the earlier version of the will at once. The solicitor didn't challenge it, and the post-mortem was waived. Because no one knew there was a newer one. "Because," Holmes said quietly, "someone removed it." I felt a chill rise despite the sun. "You think Parsons?" Number he would not have understood the legal value, and Halberd would never risk forging the solicitor's files. "No, Watson. Someone else. Someone close enough to Lady Halberd to handle her effects in the aftermath. Someone whose movements were never questioned." We stared at the water for several minutes. Then Holmes said, "It wasn't the murder that troubled me, Watson. It was how nearly it succeeded in remaining a simple tragedy." "And what stopped it?" He turned to me. "Fear. Lady Halberd's fear. But that's what killed her." "No," he said. "That's what preserved her. It made her cautious. It made her prepare. It made her ensure that someone, anyone, would look again. We walked further along the embankment before turning back toward Baker Street. When we arrived, the post had been delivered, and Holmes leafed through it absently while I removed my coat. He paused at a small envelope marked with no return address. The seal was plain red wax. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. The ink was pale, the hand unfamiliar, but the contents were unmistakably meant for him. You were right about Gregory. He was the one she told first, the one she trusted to act if she did not survive. He did not kill her, but he watched her die. He left before you arrived because his part was finished. He said justice was never the same thing as confession. He made sure I lived. That was his penance. I am safe. I will not return. Do not search for me. Thank you for believing what the police would have dismissed. I can still hear the stair creak sometimes, but I do not look back. C. Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer without comment. I sat across from him. So it ends? Holmes tilted his head. No, Watson. It continues. Just not here.
The following day, news of Eustace Halbert's confession made the early editions. While he had not admitted to murder, his fraudulent dealings were laid bare, and with the financial records authenticated, his standing among the gentry collapsed like wet parchment. The staircase at number 17 Highbury Crescent remained unoccupied, the windows shuttered. A "For Let" sign appeared briefly before vanishing again. No tenants came. The servants left in pairs, silent and swift. I visited the street once more, out of quiet obligation, and stood across from the house. There was no sound. The gate creaked in the wind. The trees, bare now, cast delicate shadows across the brick, and though the stair within could no longer whisper, it felt as if it still watched. Less a threat now, more a memory of one. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spent the remainder of the week in silence, immersed in a monograph on rare poisons used in the East. But I noticed the photograph of Lady Halberd, the one recovered from the Suffolk cottage, had not been returned to the case folder. It sat in the corner of the mantel, unframed but untouched. A ghost preserved, not for justice, but for understanding. On the 7th day, Holmes turned from the hearth and said, "Do you know what struck me most in Clara's letter?" I looked up. "What?" She said she hears the stair creak sometimes, but she does not look back. He tapped the ash from his pipe. "That, Watson, is survival." I nodded slowly, the weight of the case settling into its final shape. "And ours?" He smiled faintly. "We were only ever the ears. She was the voice." And so the case was closed, not with triumph or spectacle, but with the quiet knowledge that the truth had not disappeared, even if its keepers had. Holmes returned to his books, and I to my notes, the shadow of the staircase finally at our backs, and a silence that no longer needed to be broken. It was some weeks later, after the ink had dried on the court transcripts, after the columns in the Times had moved on to scandal in Parliament and the impending thaw of spring, when Holmes and I finally spoke of the case one last time. We were seated once more in our familiar chairs at Baker Street. Outside, the city hummed with a kind of cautious optimism. The snow melted from the gutters, the shop fronts washed clean by March rain. Yet within our rooms, it was still winter in the quiet places, lingering like the echo of footsteps on an empty stair. Holmes reached for a slim folder from the shelf beside him and handed it to me without preamble. Inside were the final notations of the case, clipped and marked with his usual efficiency. Dates, transcriptions, and the closing statement from the Home Office. Eustace Halbert had been sentenced on multiple counts of financial fraud. His title rendered meaningless, his properties seized. Though the charge of murder was never formally brought, whispers remained, especially after Inspector Lestrade discreetly reopened Lady Halbert's cause of death for internal review. No exhumation followed.
There was, it seemed, an unspoken understanding that the truth had been revealed, if not in court, then in conscience. "You never pushed for more," I said quietly, returning the folder. Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "There is a point, Watson, beyond which justice and revenge become indistinct." Clara Forrester saw that. So did her mistress. The truth was not a verdict, it was a reckoning. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the light catch on the rim of the cup. "And Gregory Halberd? Still vanished?" Holmes nodded. "A diplomat's habits die hard. The Foreign Office records indicate he surfaced briefly in Vienna, then disappeared again. I suspect he is in Tangiers by now, or the Pyrenees. He'll surface when the world forgets his name." "He watched her die," I said. "Yes, and then ensured her voice was not silenced." Holmes stood and walked to the window. The streets below bustled now, free of fog and footmen. A woman in a grey coat crossed the road beneath a black umbrella. For a brief moment, her posture reminded me of Clara. But then the image passed. "What haunts me," Holmes said suddenly, "is how little it took. A change in routine, a whisper in the dark, the subtle rearrangement of a life until its shape became unbearable. Halberd's genius was not in force, but in suggestion." He turned, the lamplight catching the sharpness in his features. "Have you ever considered how easily a person may be convinced that they are walking alone when someone is always just behind them? Not touching, not threatening, just waiting." I nodded. "And if no one believes them, they begin to doubt even the creak beneath their own feet." He moved to the mantel and picked up the photograph of Lady Halberd, the same one we had recovered from the Suffolk cottage. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a rare gesture of ceremony, he placed it into an envelope and sealed it with wax. "She was brave," I said. "She was precise," Holmes replied. "She planted every seed, and she knew which of us would follow the trail." He handed me the envelope. "Post it to the solicitor. Quietly. Let it find its way back to the Halberd estate. The house will change hands. Perhaps a new family will climb those stairs, but the last one to fall there should not be forgotten." I took the envelope and tucked it into my coat pocket. As I turned to leave, Holmes's voice followed me. "Watson?" I paused at the threshold. "There is no ghost at Highbury Crescent," he said. "Only the memory of how far a man will go when the fear of exposure is greater than the fear of sin." Outside, the evening light touched the rooftops with gold. I walked the long way to the post office, and when I dropped the envelope through the brass slot, I felt no finality, only the strange hush that follows a story when it has been told just enough. That night in my journal, I wrote a final note beneath the title, "The Case of the Death That Waited on the Stair." It was not the fall that killed her. It was the silence before it. And it was broken, not by force, but by those who refused to let it stand. And so ended one of the quietest, most unnerving cases we ever undertook. One in which no gun was fired, no knife drawn, and yet the presence of murder was as unmistakable as the echo of a single footstep on a stair that no one else heard. Except Sherlock Holmes, 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 Sherlock